Have you ever wondered what truly happened to a woman in a medieval court the moment her reputation slipped, even by a single whisper? Before chronicles softened the edges, before legends masked the brutality, the fall of a courtwoman was not a simple loss of privilege. It was a descent engineered by powerful men who understood exactly how to destroy someone without leaving a visible trace. And what you are about to uncover begins long before the first accusation was spoken aloud. In the great halls filled with velvet, gold, and ceremony, one misinterpreted gesture or one jealous rival was enough to shift the air around her. Nobles watched everything with the eyes of hunters, calculating how a single misstep could be turned into political currency. For the woman at the center of it, the fall rarely started with a dramatic confrontation. It began with the quiet withdrawal of smiles, the sudden stiffness in greetings, the subtle way servants were instructed to avoid her presence. Isolation was always the first blade, invisible, but deeply effective. The court operated on hierarchy, but it thrived on fear. And when a woman fell from grace, she became the perfect warning to the others. Her allies hesitated, uncertain whether defending her would endanger their own standing. Her enemies, on the other hand, sharpened their words, waiting for the moment they could turn rumor into narrative, and narrative into weapon. This was not simply politics. It was ritualized cruelty, perfected over generations. As her world tightened around her, she began to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Doors that once opened easily now seemed to hesitate before allowing her inside. Conversation stopped when she approached. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, measuring her worth, deciding if she still deserved a place in the carefully orchestrated order of the palace. What began as a whisper soon became a shadow she could not outrun, a shadow that followed her through every corridor. And yet, the most chilling part is that her downfall was rarely spontaneous. It was planned, nurtured, and encouraged by those who stood to benefit from her collapse. The nobles knew how to conceal their intentions behind rituals, ceremonies, and smiles that looked almost sincere. But underneath that elegance lived a cruelty so profound that even allies sometimes recoiled when the truth came to light. What you are about to see is how that carefully staged decline transformed into consequences far darker than most people today could imagine. Before we move forward, I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed someone lose everything because of a rumor they never had a chance to defend? If this topic resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like to help this story reach more people, and check if you are already subscribed to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. What you will discover now may surprise you, and it leads directly into the next part of this unraveling descent, where the first subtle signs of disgrace become impossible to ignore. What came next for a court woman who had begun to fall from grace was rarely dramatic, but it was always deliberate. Once the atmosphere around her shifted, the first indicators of her impending downfall appeared in places so subtle that even the most perceptive struggled to recognize them at first. The nobles never acted abruptly. They preferred to dismantle her position piece by piece, allowing the process to feel almost natural, as if her fading relevance were simply the result of misfortune rather than intentional orchestrations. Yet every gesture, every withheld invitation, every shift in protocol had a purpose. It often began with her absence from certain gatherings that she had once been automatically included in. A small banquet, a ceremony, a private reception held by the queen or a high-ranking advisor. The explanations were always politely vague, carefully crafted to seem harmless. The message, however, was unmistakable. She was no longer essential. In a society governed by proximity to power, being omitted even once signaled the beginning of a slow erasure. Servants, who understood court rhythms better than anyone, began adjusting their behavior as well. They approached her with a mix of caution and curiosity, sensing that her presence no longer carried the same authority. Those small hesitations were reflections of larger forces moving around her. Even the way her name was spoken began to change. Once pronounced with admiration or strategic interest, it now carried a tone of reservation. Nobles exchanged glances when she entered a room, as if aware of something she was not. Rumors did not need to be spoken aloud to be effective. Sometimes silence was far more damaging. The court knew how to weaponize absence. A conversation that suddenly ended when she approached, a notice that failed to reach her, a request that used to be fulfilled instantly, but now took far too long. These small fractures were merely the beginning of the structure collapsing beneath her. As the pressure mounted, she felt herself slipping into a liminal state, still present, but no longer anchored. Her allies became cautious, unsure whether defending her would damage their own reputation. Her enemies, meanwhile, sensed opportunity. Their strategies were rarely loud. They preferred to plant seeds rather than shout accusations. A raised eyebrow here, a murmured remark there, a subtle insinuation about her loyalty, her conduct, or her influence. The court rewarded subtlety, and the most effective attacks were those that could never be traced back to a single moment. Her daily life transformed into a maze of uncertainties. Rooms that once felt familiar became treacherous, filled with layered meanings and veiled intentions. She found herself analyzing gestures that previously meant nothing, searching for clues about her standing. Even the way others greeted her held weight. A greeting delivered with too much formality signaled distance. One delivered too casually suggested disrespect. She was trapped in a system where every interaction became a test she could not win. And while she tried to maintain her composure, the nobles observed everything. They watched how she reacted, how she carried herself, how she attempted to preserve dignity in a space determined to remove it. Their scrutiny was not rooted in curiosity but in anticipation, waiting to see how far she would fall, and how quickly the process could be accelerated once the foundation had been weakened enough. As the early signs multiplied around her, the transformation from respected figure to vulnerable target became inevitable, setting the stage for what would unfold next in the shadows of the palace. Once the first cracks in her standing became visible, the nobles shifted to a more calculated phase of her downfall, one designed to isolate her, completely before the true ruin began. This stage was never chaotic. It was organized, controlled, and executed with the precision of a ritual. The goal was simple: strip her of every alliance, fragment her reputation, and leave her without any structure to lean on when the accusations finally surfaced. In a court where influence meant survival, isolation was the most effective weapon. The process started with controlling who could be seen with her. Invitations she once extended were suddenly ignored. Women she had mentored turned away when she approached, offering polite excuses but refusing proximity. Conversations she tried to join dissolved instantly, replaced by a subtle tension that pushed her to the margins. Even her presence inside the palace was managed. Guards who once bowed with respect now maintained a rigid distance, as if her mere shadow carried implications they wished to avoid. Every interaction signaled that she was becoming untouchable. Allies who had benefited from her connections began to withdraw quietly, not because they no longer valued her, but because the court made it clear that standing beside her meant forfeiting their own security. In this world, everyone was replaceable, and loyalty was a luxury few could afford. Many who had praised her in private now avoided her gaze in public. Their silence was not born from malice, but from self-preservation, and she could feel it. The shift was not loud, but the absence of support echoed in every corridor she walked through. The nobles, however, did not simply wait for her relationships to crumble, they actively ensured it. Small misunderstandings were deliberately encouraged. Servants were instructed to deliver messages late, or not at all, creating the appearance that she had missed commitments or ignored obligations. Minor protocol breaches were magnified into whispers about irresponsibility, Compliments she offered to others were reframed as manipulations. A subtle narrative was constructed, not yet damaging enough to expose, but harmful enough to make others question her integrity. The isolation was also psychological. By removing the stability of routine and altering the behavior of everyone around her, they created an environment where she questioned her own intuition. Was she imagining the coldness? Were the omissions accidental? The uncertainty was part of the strategy. A woman doubting her own perception was easier to discredit and easier to control. The court thrived on ambiguity, and in this atmosphere, she became increasingly unsure of where she stood and who she could trust. Her living quarters, once filled with activity, grew quieter. The number of servants assigned to her decreased, supposedly due to logistical decisions, but everyone knew this reduction carried a message. The absence of chatter in the mornings, the delayed arrival of garments, the disappearance of small luxuries she had always taken for granted, all signaled that her comfort was no longer a priority. The palace had begun rearranging itself around her absence, treating her as though she were already fading from relevance. The nobles observed her deterioration with a kind of detached fascination. They measured how she moved, how she spoke, how often she hesitated. Isolation was not only a method of weakening her, it was also a test of how far she could be pushed before breaking. And as the walls closed around her, the court prepared for the next stage, the one in which her isolation would no longer be subtle, and the consequences of her fall would become undeniable in the eyes of those who waited for the spectacle to unfold. As the walls of isolation tightened around her, the nobles initiated a far more insidious stage of punishment, one that never appeared in official records but shaped the reality of countless women who fell from grace. These were the social penalties, subtle yet devastating, designed to dismantle her identity in the eyes of the court, long before any formal accusation surfaced. While physical punishments left marks that could be questioned or pitied, social punishments left none, allowing the nobility to maintain the illusion of civility even as they destroyed her life with meticulous cruelty. The first of these hidden punishments unfolded through orchestrated exclusion. Servants were instructed to adjust her seating in gatherings, so she was placed at the edge of the room, far from influence, far from conversation, far from relevance. The change was presented as a simple oversight, but everyone understood the symbolism. In the court, placement reflected value, and her new location silently announced her diminishing importance. Others took note, adjusting their behavior accordingly, unwilling to be seen too close to someone whose fall might taint their own position. Another punishment involved controlling how she appeared before others. Attendants who once ensured her elegance were now subtly negligent. A garment would be delivered slightly wrinkled, a hairstyle executed with less care, a minor accessory misplaced. These imperfections were small, but in an environment where appearance communicated power, they chipped away at her prestige. Observers noticed the changes and interpreted them as signs of instability or moral decline, unaware that the neglect was planned, not accidental. Even her voice was targeted. When she spoke during gatherings, others interrupted her more freely, seizing the moment to demonstrate that she no longer commanded respect. She found herself hesitating before contributing, aware that any word could be twisted or dismissed. The court prized eloquence, but now her eloquence was framed as defiance or manipulation, depending on what best served the unfolding narrative against her. Conversations that once welcomed her insights now treated her as an unwelcome guest whose presence disrupted the harmony of noble affairs. Small rituals of status also began to erode. Bows were shallower. Doors opened slower. Announcements of her arrival became muted, stripped of formality. Her presence, once acknowledged with graceful ceremony, was now treated with a cold efficiency that signaled she was no longer part of the inner sphere. Each missed formal gesture reinforced the unspoken truth. She was being erased in plain sight. Behind these orchestrated humiliations stood the nobles, whose mastery of social cruelty allowed them to strike without appearing to lift a finger. Their power lay not in open aggression, but in carefully shaping the environment until she became a stranger in the very palace she once helped define. Their actions were deliberate but untraceable, ensuring that any attempt she made to defend herself would be interpreted as paranoia or impropriety. The more she tried to reclaim her standing, the more they tightened the social noose, ensuring she could not rise again. And as these hidden punishments grew more frequent, she felt a profound shift, not only in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. The weight of whispered judgments, the cold precision of orchestrated humiliation, and the silent withdrawal of respect gnawed at her confidence, preparing her for a downfall far more public and devastating than she yet imagined. What waited ahead was no longer subtle, no longer deniable, and the court was already positioning itself to witness the next stage of her collapse. Before moving on, share in the comments what you think about these hidden forms of social punishment that never appeared in chronicles. Which part struck you the most? Your insight helps deepen this exploration as we continue. When the subtle punishments were no longer enough to contain her perceived disgrace, the court shifted to a far more visible phase of humiliation. This was the point where private cruelty transformed into public spectacle, where the body of the woman itself became a political instrument. Nobles understood that public shame was far more effective than any whispered rumor, and they wielded it with precision, turning her into a living declaration of what happened to anyone who dared disrupt the fragile balance of power. The process was calculated to fracture her dignity and reinforce the dominance of those who orchestrated her fall. It often began with wardrobe changes imposed under the guise of ceremonial requirements. A woman who once wore garments that reflected her status was now given fabrics of inferior quality or colors associated with misfortune or impropriety. These changes were subtle enough to appear accidental, but blatant enough for observers to interpret as a statement. In courts that communicated through symbols, clothing became a silent proclamation of her fading honor. The nobles monitored every reaction she received, noting who stared too long, who whispered, who pretended not to notice. Her movements within the palace were also manipulated. She was instructed to attend gatherings that previously required her presence only as a respected member of the court. Now she attended them as an example. She would enter a hall to find conversations pause just long enough for people to absorb her altered appearance, then resume with attention that crawled beneath the surface. Eyes followed her, but not with admiration. Instead, they held a mix of fascination and caution, as if watching a performance whose ending they already knew but did not want to miss. The court became a stage, and she became the unwilling actor. Even tasks that once displayed her refinement were twisted into opportunities for mockery. If she played an instrument, her performance was greeted with polite but hollow applause, the kind offered to someone tolerated rather than valued. If she danced, small missteps were exaggerated through murmured commentary. If she greeted others, they responded with a level of formality that underscored her isolation. The court watched how she carried this burden, observing whether she would break or continue to resist the narrative being imposed upon her. Then came the rituals of silence. In some courts, walking past a woman in disgrace required deliberate avoidance, a public demonstration that she no longer belonged. Those who crossed her path looked past her as if she had become invisible. This erasure was devastating, stripping her not only of status but of identity. The nobles, skilled in the art of psychological punishment, ensured that she felt the weight of every averted gaze and every sudden quiet that marked her presence. Even rumors shifted in nature. Where earlier suggestions questioned her reliability or character, the new whispers focused on the spectacle she had become. People commented on how she held herself, how she tried to maintain dignity despite the mounting pressure, how she attempted to navigate the labyrinth of humiliation without collapsing. Her struggle became entertainment, a cruel source of fascination that fueled debates behind closed doors. The most chilling aspect of this stage was that it required no official decree. No document recorded her disgrace. No law sentenced her. Her punishment was woven into the daily life of the palace, carried out through glances, whispers, and orchestrated moments of shame. And as this spectacle grew more elaborate, the court prepared for the next level of cruelty, one that targeted her mind and spirit in ways far more destructive than anything she had yet endured. Once her humiliation became a public performance, the nobles advanced to a stage far more calculated and devastating: the psychological breaking of the woman they had marked for ruin. This phase did not rely on spectacle, but on quiet, methodical manipulation, engineered to erode her sense of self until she no longer resembled the figure who once navigated the palace with confidence. In the courts of old, physical punishment was obvious and crude. True mastery lay in dismantling a person without ever leaving a trace. And this was the art the nobles perfected. The first tactic involved controlling her reality. Information was withheld from her, then presented inconsistently, leaving her uncertain about the truth. She would hear that an event had been rescheduled, only to discover it had not. She would be told that someone had requested her presence, only to arrive and find no such request existed. These contradictions were not accidental. They were designed to destabilize her perception, to make her question her memory, her intuition, and eventually, her worth. A woman who doubted herself was far easier to manipulate. Another method involved manipulating her relationships. People she relied on for emotional or social support were instructed to keep their distance. Some responded with coldness, others with feigned pity, each interaction crafted to confuse her. When she attempted to confront the distance, she was met with vague excuses, shifting explanations, and the unmistakable sense that she was becoming the source of discomfort rather than the victim of a calculated scheme. The palace itself seemed to conspire against her, turning familiar faces into unrecognizable threats. They also targeted her routine. Tasks she once performed with ease were suddenly scrutinized, corrected, or quietly sabotaged. A misplaced document, a missed message, a misinterpreted instruction. Each small incident painted her as unreliable. And because these errors appeared to originate from her own actions, she internalized them as personal failings. The more she tried to regain control, the more the court arranged situations that made her appear incapable. Her confidence eroded under the weight of these orchestrated failures. Isolation deepened as the palace whispered about her instability. Her gestures were analyzed, her tone dissected, her expressions interpreted with malice. If she remained quiet, she was accused of brooding. If she spoke with firmness, she was called emotional. Every response she offered fed the narrative crafted against her, trapping her in a cycle where any attempt to reclaim dignity was reframed as further evidence of her decline. The nobles excelled at this kind of entrapment, leaving no path available that did not lead to deeper disgrace. Sleep often became her only refuge, yet even that was disrupted. Nights were plagued by uncertainty, her mind circling the unanswered questions and contradictions woven into her daily life. She woke, each morning more exhausted than the last, physically present but emotionally adrift. The palace, once a place she understood intimately, had transformed into a labyrinth of invisible threats and unspoken judgments. What made this psychological breaking so potent was its invisibility. No witness could point to a single act of cruelty. No chronicler could record a specific punishment. But the effect was unmistakable. A slow unraveling of the self, a hollowing out of identity. And as she reached this fragile state, the nobles prepared the next layer of their cruelty, one hidden so deeply within the palace walls that even the most loyal chroniclers feared to put it into writing. There were punishments the chronicles dared not record, practices whispered about only in the quietest corners of the palace, where even servants feared to speak above a murmur. These forms of violence did not rely on public humiliation or subtle manipulation. They occurred in the dim privacy of inner chambers, where nobles and advisors exercised a level of power that blurred the boundaries between discipline and outright cruelty. For a woman who had fallen from grace, the palace transformed into a place where danger moved silently, masked by rituals and customs that outsiders could never fully understand. The first of these hidden practices was forced seclusion, a method disguised as protection or reflection. She would be escorted to chambers far from the central halls, spaces rarely used and intentionally isolated. Guards monitored her movements not with respect, but with scrutiny, and the silence that filled these rooms became its own form of torment. Days stretched without visitors, her world reduced to the echo of her own footsteps. The nobles claimed this separation allowed the court to calm political tensions, but everyone knew it was a tool to weaken her spirit away from prying eyes. More chilling were the interrogations that followed. They were never officially ordered and never documented. A counselor might summon her late at night, presenting the summons as an urgent matter of state. The questioning that awaited her was rarely about truth. Instead, it was about pressure. Questions were repeated in cycles, phrased differently, designed to confuse her until she contradicted herself. They asked about alliances, motives, hidden intentions, anything that could later be twisted into an accusation. No matter how she answered, the result always cast suspicion on her. Character. She left these sessions drained, aware that every word she spoke had been a trap. In some courts, symbolic punishments were inflicted behind closed doors, measures that preserved appearances while inflicting psychological damage. She might be forced to kneel for hours in ritual postures under the pretext of penitence. She might be assigned tasks far beneath her status, tasks meant to degrade rather than discipline. She might even be denied basic comforts such as warmth or adequate rest, all justified as temporary measures to preserve order. These acts were not visible to the wider court, but their effects were impossible to hide. Her posture stiffened, her eyes dimmed, her movements slowed as exhaustion settled into her bones. The cruelty deepened when the nobles manipulated the environment itself to torment her. Servants were instructed to deliver meals late, creating uncertainty about whether she would receive food at all. Her sleeping quarters were intentionally chilled or left in disarray. Personal items she relied on for emotional stability disappeared without explanation. The palace became a living adversary, each small disruption engineered to remind her that she no longer possessed control over even the smallest aspects of her life. Yet, the most frightening aspect of these hidden practices was how seamlessly they blended into the court's daily functioning. No outsider could distinguish a legitimate political process from an orchestrated act of cruelty. The nobles operated with such refinement that even those who pitied her were powerless to intervene. Anyone who attempted to help risked drawing suspicion onto themselves, creating an atmosphere where silence was the safest choice. This silence allowed the palace to commit its most calculated acts of violence without consequence, shaping her destiny in ways that would haunt her long after her name faded from official accounts. Share in the comments your thoughts on these hidden forms of violence that chroniclers feared to record. Which part of this unseen cruelty do you believe caused the deepest impact? While the nobles orchestrated her downfall with precision, another force moved quietly through the palace corridors, shaping her fate in ways even more complex: the other women of the court. Their role in the rise and fall of those around them was rarely acknowledged in official records, but in reality, they were among the most influential participants in the drama of downfall and disgrace. Some acted out of fear, others out of ambition, and a few out of compassion dangerously close to rebellion. Their responses formed a delicate web of alliances and betrayals that could either soften her decline or sharpen its cruelty. The women who feared for their own position maintained a cautious distance. They understood better than anyone how easily a misplaced word or unguarded act could mark them as accomplices. These women moved through the palace with calculated neutrality, offering polite greetings but nothing more. Their detachment was not driven by malice, but by a desperate instinct for survival. They had watched others fall before, and they recognized the signs. To remain untouched themselves, they learned to treat her as though she were already fading from existence. Others, however, seized the opportunity to strengthen their own status. In the competitive hierarchy of the court, every downfall opened space for someone else to rise. These women became eager participants in the narrative woven against her. They whispered subtle interpretations of her actions, redefined old interactions to imply hidden motives, and presented themselves as stable alternatives to the perceived threat she now represented. Their influence was quiet, but powerful, shaping the opinions of nobles and advisors through carefully timed comments and delicately veiled insinuations. But there were also women who remembered her kindness, who owed her loyalty, or who simply could not stomach the cruelty unfolding around them. These women attempted to help, though their efforts were often limited by the dangers involved. Some sent her small comforts in secret: a warm cloak, a reassuring message, a token reminding her she had not been entirely abandoned. Others tried to intervene indirectly by redirecting harmful rumors, softening harsh interpretations, or shielding her from the most aggressive forms of scrutiny. Their compassion was genuine, but in a court, where every gesture was observed, even the smallest act of support risked becoming ammunition for those intent on tearing her down. The tension between these different groups of women created an emotional battlefield layered beneath the palace's already treacherous politics. Each woman navigated her own fears, ambitions, and moral boundaries, and every choice influenced the fragile balance surrounding the one who had fallen from grace. The woman herself felt this shifting landscape even without seeing its full shape. She noticed who avoided her, who dared to meet her gaze, and who seemed torn between sympathy and self-preservation. These interactions, subtle as they were, shaped her understanding of her own diminishing position. In some instances, the cruelty of other women proved sharper than that of the nobles, not because they wielded more power, but because they understood the emotional terrain more intimately. A single, carefully timed comment, a deliberate omission, or a well-placed sigh could inflict wounds that cut deeper than any public humiliation. And the nobles, observing these dynamics with interest, often allowed the internal conflicts among court women to further their own strategies, letting the social fabric tear itself apart without lifting a hand. Yet, even in the midst of this complex social storm, moments of solidarity flickered. A quiet reassurance, a shared glance of understanding, a subtle gesture of empathy. Small acts that reminded her she was not entirely alone. These fleeting expressions of humanity did not stop her fall, but they offered glimpses of the world beyond cruelty, even as the palace prepared to turn her punishment into a spectacle that would reach far beyond private chambers. As her fate spiraled further into the hands of those who sought her downfall, the palace moved to its most grotesque and calculated stage, transforming her suffering into a spectacle for the elite. This was not a public execution, nor a formal trial, nor even a documented ritual. It was something far more sinister, wrapped in the elegance of courtly gatherings and justified as tradition, entertainment, or political necessity. The nobles understood that nothing reinforced their authority more strongly than turning a fallen woman into an object lesson for everyone watching. It often began with orchestrated moments designed to expose her vulnerability. She might be summoned unexpectedly to a gathering where she once held influence, placed before an audience that already knew the unspoken script. The nobles would greet her with ceremonious politeness, masking their delight in her discomfort. Questions were posed in ways that highlighted her diminished status. Small remarks were framed to draw attention to her isolation, and her every movement became a source of analysis and quiet amusement. These scenes were crafted to appear harmless, but they were anything but. Each one chipped away at her humanity. Even her silence was exploited. When she stood quietly, the nobles interpreted her restraint as evidence of guilt or weakness. When she attempted to respond with dignity, they twisted her composure into arrogance. There was no position she could take that did not fit the narrative already imposed upon her. The court did not simply observe her humiliation. It choreographed it with the precision of a performance, allowing everyone present to participate in a spectacle without openly admitting to their cruelty. Nobles, who rarely interacted with her before, now found reasons to approach. They asked questions they knew she could not answer freely, offered false sympathy, or expressed concern that carried the sharpness of a blade hidden beneath velvet words. Every gesture served a dual purpose: to reinforce her fall and to reassure others of the stability of the hierarchy. Those who once envied her grace and influence now studied her downfall with a mixture of satisfaction and caution, aware that her misfortune served as a warning for them as well. The palace layout itself contributed to this grim theater. Hallways that forced her to cross paths with groups who whispered about her as she passed, antechambers where she was made to wait beneath the scrutiny of attendants, dining halls where her placement at the table became a visual representation of her decline. The architecture amplified her disgrace, turning every corner into a stage where she performed the role assigned to her. Even servants, trained to remain neutral, could not fully mask the tension their presence carried. Rumors flourished in this environment. Her gestures were interpreted as signs of emotional instability. Her reduced presence in certain rooms was taken as an admission of guilt. Even the fatigue in her eyes became a topic of speculation. Each whisper spread through the palace like smoke, impossible to grasp and more impossible to stop. And as the nobles repeated these rumors with feigned regret, they deepened the narrative until her identity dissolved beneath layers of invented offenses. The cruelty of this spectacle lay in its elegance. No one raised a hand against her. No one issued a formal accusation. Yet the entire court participated in her destruction, cloaked in etiquette and refined behavior. Her suffering became a mirror for their power, a demonstration of the palace's ability to shape destiny without ever dirtying its hands. As this spectacle grew, it paved the way for the final stage of her decline, one that would determine whether she vanished completely from the court or survived as a shadow of her former self. As the spectacle of her suffering reached its peak, the palace prepared to deliver the final blow, one that would determine whether she remained a silent prisoner of reputation or was erased entirely from the memory of those who once admired her. The nobles understood that the ultimate punishment was not physical, nor even public humiliation, but the quiet removal of a person's identity from the fabric of court life. This final stage was subtle in appearance, but devastating in its effect, designed to ensure she could never reclaim the status, influence, or dignity she had once held so effortlessly. The first sign of this ultimate transition came through the reassignment of her possessions. Items that symbolized her presence, embroidered garments, personal scrolls, cherished trinkets, were redistributed or quietly absorbed into the palace archives. Nothing was thrown away. Everything was repurposed, as if she no longer had the right to possess anything that bore her touch. This dissolution of personal history was not merely administrative. It erased the evidence that she had once belonged, once mattered. When others walked past her former chambers, they saw only a repainted doorway or a newly assigned attendant, reminders of how swiftly the court replaced what it no longer valued. Her duties were the next to vanish, responsibilities that once relied on her skill, knowledge, or influence were handed to others without explanation. Meetings she used to lead continued without her. Decisions that once required her insight were made in her absence. Each omission signaled that the court had already moved forward, leaving her stranded in a life that no longer recognized her. She felt herself drifting between the rooms like a ghost, present but irrelevant, acknowledged only in the most perfunctory ways. Then came the social silence, the deliberate forgetting. Where whispers once followed her steps, now there was nothing. Her name was no longer spoken in debates or arguments. Her past contributions were credited to others or dismissed entirely. Even those who had once envied her no longer bothered to reference her downfall. The court had extracted the lesson it needed, and now she served no further purpose. This silence was colder than humiliation, more suffocating than isolation. It signified that she had become invisible. Yet, within this darkness, a deeper truth emerged. Not all who witnessed her decline agreed with the cruelty inflicted upon her. Some recognized the injustice but lacked the power to intervene. Others, observing the extent of her suffering, quietly questioned the morality of a system that could dismantle a life so elegantly, so completely. And though the palace preferred silence, the memory of what had been done lingered in the minds of those who understood that power unchecked always demanded a sacrifice. Her story, though unwritten, would influence future decisions, future alliances, future betrayals. Still, her destiny depended on whether she chose to remain within the walls that had destroyed her, or sought whatever life waited beyond them. Some women disappeared entirely into religious sanctuaries, becoming shadows in histories that barely remembered their names. Others married minor nobles in distant provinces, starting anew far from the court that had swallowed them whole. And a rare few stayed, living as quiet observers who carried the knowledge of what power had cost them. The palace, indifferent to these outcomes, simply continued its cycle, ready to find another woman to raise or another to break. If you reached this point of the story, let me know by commenting the phrase "I am still here." It is a simple way to show me you stayed with this narrative until the final breath of her journey. And if this exploration of hidden cruelty and erased histories resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep uncovering the parts of the past that were never supposed to be seen. Leave a like as well, but only if you felt the weight and value of this story. There is another video here on the side that deepens this world even further. So click and continue with me as we unravel more truths history tried to forget.